The station was loud, incredibly loud. It was that time of the evening when the day feels longest, right around 5:30. The air inside the massive terminal was thick and smelled of old dust, coffee, and the metallic tang of the train tracks. Thousands of people were moving through the hall, a river of coats and bags and tired faces. Everyone was in a hurry. It was like a race where no one wins, but everyone is afraid to lose. High above, the announcement board clicked and clacked as the times changed, and a robotic voice echoed off the high, tiled ceiling, warning people to stand back behind the yellow line. Down on the floor, the sound was a chaotic mix of heavy footsteps, shuffling bags, and hundreds of private conversations all happening at once. People were checking their watches, frowning at their phones, or staring blankly at the exit signs, their minds already on dinner or the work they hadn't finished yet. In the very middle of this huge, busy hall, standing somewhat awkwardly against a pillar, was a piano. It wasn't a small piano. It was a grand piano, shiny and black, but it looked a little out of place. It had been put there as a gift to the city, a "Play Me, I'm Yours" invitation for anyone passing by to sit down and make some music. But usually nobody did. Most days it just sat there like a piece of furniture that nobody wanted, gathering fingerprints from curious tourists who would poke a key and run away. It was a silent island in a sea of rushing noise. Into this chaotic scene walked a very small boy. He looked no older than 7. He was wearing a school uniform, a gray blazer that was slightly too big for his small shoulders, shorts, and a little cap held tightly in his left hand. On his back he carried a backpack that looked heavy, bouncing slightly as he walked. He was tiny compared to the adults around him. In this crowd of giants he was invisible. The crowd didn't stop for him. A tall man in a dark coat brushed past him, almost knocking the boy off balance, but didn't even say sorry. A woman talking loudly on her phone swerved around him, her eyes fixed on the sign for the trains. The boy seemed used to this. He moved carefully, trying to stay out of the way, hugging the wall to avoid the fast-walking legs of the commuters. He looked tired. His hair was messy from the wind outside, and his eyes were wide, taking in the overwhelming size of the station. He wasn't moving with purpose like everyone else. He wasn't rushing to a platform or heading for the exit. He was just wandering. He stopped for a moment near a schedule board, looking confused, but he wasn't looking for a train time. He just seemed to be soaking in the atmosphere. He looked around, his head turning left and right, searching for something in the faces of the strangers. But no one looked back at him. Everyone was in their own world, trapped behind invisible walls of stress and routine. Then, he saw it. The shiny black piano sitting in the open space of the concourse caught his eye. It was like a magnet for him. He stopped walking completely. The backpack slipped down his shoulders a bit as he stood still, staring at the instrument. The crowd continued to flow around him like water around a rock. People parted to go past him, annoyed that he was standing still in the middle of the walkway. But he didn't notice their frustration. He took a few slow steps toward the piano. He walked with a strange mix of hesitation and wonder. As he got closer, you could see how small he really was. The piano bench was high, and the piano itself looked massive compared to his little frame. He walked around the side of it, running his hand along the smooth, cold wood. He looked at the Keys 88 black and white teeth waiting to smile. A security guard stood a few meters away, leaning against a pillar, half watching the crowd. He saw the boy approach the piano, but didn't move. He assumed the kid would just bang on it with his fists and run away, which happened all the time. The guard checked his radio, bored, expecting a crash of noise any second. The boy reached the bench. He looked around again, maybe looking for a parent or a teacher, but there was no one coming for him. He was alone. He adjusted his backpack straps, took a deep breath that made his small chest rise and fall, and climbed up onto the bench. His feet dangled high above the floor. He couldn't reach the pedals, and he had to slide forward just to reach the keys properly. The people walking by barely glanced at him. To them, he was just a kid wasting time on a toy. A couple of teenagers stopped for a second to laugh, probably expecting to hear a silly tune or a mess of wrong notes. They held their phones up, ready to record a funny video to share online. The indifference in the air was heavy. It was a cold, gray place full of tired people, and this small boy seemed like the least important thing in it. But then his posture changed. He stopped looking around. He stopped looking like a lost little boy. He straightened his back. He rested his hands gently on his knees for a moment, then raised them and hovered them over the keys. His expression went from confused to serious, almost peaceful. The noise of the station, the announcements, the shouting, the running seemed to fade away for him. He was in his own world now, a world that existed right there on that bench. He placed his fingers on the keys, not to bang them, but to test them. He pressed one white key, then a black one. The sound was clear and bell-like. It wasn't a thud. It was a note that sang for a second. He adjusted his position, his small shoes swinging slightly, and settled his fingers into a position that looked professional, like he had done this 1,000 times before. The commuters rushing past had no idea that the ordinary moment they were witnessing was just seconds away from turning into something they would never forget. The small boy, the piano, and the waiting crowd were all holding their breath, waiting for the magic to start. The boy sat on the bench, his legs dangling helplessly above the polished floor. He looked even smaller now that he was seated next to the massive body of the grand piano. The instrument loomed over him like a black shiny beast, and he was just a tiny mouse trying to tame it. To the people rushing past, it looked almost comical. It was like a toddler sitting in the driver's seat of a bus. The expectation was heavy in the air. Everyone who saw him out of the corner of their eye assumed the same thing. Any second now, this kid was going to slam his palms down on the keys and create a terrible noise. They were already bracing themselves for the chaos. A businessman in a gray suit stopped near the pillar to tie his shoelace. He glanced up at the boy, his face tired and bored. He shook his head slightly, a look of mild annoyance crossing his face. He was probably thinking that public pianos were a waste of space. If they were just going to be used as playgrounds by unsupervised children. He finished tying his shoe and stood up, but he didn't walk away immediately. He paused, watching, perhaps waiting to see if he needed to tell the boy to get down. The station was still incredibly loud. The trains were braking on the tracks above, making a screeching sound that hurt the ears. The announcement board clicked again. A group of tourists laughed loudly nearby, taking pictures of the ceiling. But in this small circle around the piano, there was a strange kind of quiet tension. It was the feeling you get just before something happens, though nobody could say what. The boy didn't look left or right anymore. He didn't look at the businessman or the tourists. He was focused entirely on the keys in front of him. He wiggled his fingers a little bit, shaking out the tension. He looked serious. His face wasn't smiling or playful. It was set in a look of deep concentration. He reached out with his right hand and his left hand at the same time. His hands were so small that they looked like little starfish resting on the ivory. He positioned them carefully, not slapping the surface, but touching them with a gentle respect, like he was handling something very fragile. The businessman folded his arms, waiting for the bang. A young woman stopped texting on her phone to look. She had headphones around her neck, and she looked curious but skeptical. She had seen people play this piano before. Usually it was a teenager playing a pop song badly, or an old man playing Happy Birthday. She expected something simple, something childish. She stood a few feet away, tapping her foot, ready to move on as soon as the noise started. The boy took a deep breath. You could see his little shoulders rise up and then fall down slowly. He was centering himself. It was a strange thing to see in a 7-year-old in the middle of a dirty train station. It looked like a ritual. The air around him seemed to change. It felt like the noise of the station was pressing in on him, trying to break his focus, but he was building a wall against it. He stretched his fingers wide. The span of his hand was barely enough to reach an octave, but he stretched it as far as it would go. He hovered his fingers over the keys for just a second longer. The suspense was actually painful now. The few people who had stopped watching felt a weird urge to say something, to break the silence, but they held back. They were trapped by the intensity of the boy's posture. Then it happened. His hands dropped. They didn't bang. They didn't slap. They descended with a controlled grace that seemed impossible for a child that size. His fingers struck the keys, but it wasn't a hit. It was a caress. The sound that came out wasn't a jarring crash. It was a single, clear note that rang out like a bell in a church tower. Then came a second note and a third. It was a chord, major and beautiful, but it was played so softly that it barely cut through the rumble of the station. The businessman blinked. He unfolded his arms. The woman with the headphones looked up, her eyes widening slightly. This wasn't what they expected. The sound wasn't messy or annoying. It was pure. The quality of the tone was shocking. It sounded professional. It sounded like the piano was being played by someone who had studied for years. Not a kid with a backpack. The boy didn't stop. As soon as the first chord faded, his fingers moved. They danced across the white keys, finding the black keys with an instinct that looked like magic. He wasn't hunting and pecking for the right notes. He knew exactly where they were. His left hand started playing a low, rhythmic pattern, while his right hand began to weave a melody. It wasn't a nursery rhyme. It wasn't "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." It was something complex and classical. It was heavy and full of emotion. The sound began to grow, filling the small space around the piano. It was like a sudden rainstorm starting in the middle of a desert. The businessman took a step closer, forgetting about his train. The woman with the headphones forgot her text message. A few more people turned their heads. The contrast was jarring. Here was this tiny, scruffy boy in a school uniform, sitting on a hard bench, playing music that sounded like it belonged in a royal concert hall. The disconnect between what they saw and what they heard was confusing their brains. The boy's face remained calm. He wasn't smiling. He was looking at his hands, but he wasn't seeing them. He was hearing the music in his head before it even happened. His feet swung slightly in time with the rhythm, unable to reach the pedals to sustain the notes, so he had to move his fingers faster to keep the sound from breaking. It was a difficult thing to do, a technical challenge that would trip up a seasoned player, but he did it without effort. The music began to swirl, rising and falling like waves. It was sad but hopeful at the same time. The notes were crisp and clean, cutting through the greasy atmosphere of the station. People who were walking by, focused on their own destination, suddenly found themselves stopping. They didn't know why. It was like a hook had caught their jacket. They just stopped and turned. The noise of the crowd didn't disappear. The trains were still running. The announcements were still blaring, but the music seemed to carve out a bubble of silence around the piano. Inside that bubble, there was only the sound of the boy playing. The skepticism on the faces of the onlookers melted away. The annoyance was replaced by confusion. They looked at the boy, then at each other, their eyes asking the same question: "Is this really happening?" The boy didn't care about the audience. He didn't look up to see if they were impressed. For him, the station had vanished. He was in his own world, a world of sound and feeling. He pressed down harder on the keys, and the piano responded with a roar that vibrated through the floor and up the legs of the people standing nearby. The piece was building. It was getting faster. The complexity of the notes was increasing, his hands crossing over each other. A blur of motion, a security guard who had been leaning lazily against a pillar stood up straight. He took a few steps forward, his hand on his belt, not to stop the boy, but to get a better look. He had seen many people play that piano, but he had never seen anything like this. He shook his head slowly, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He knew, just like everyone else was starting to know, that this was not a normal moment. This was something special. The small boy wasn't just touching the keys. He was speaking a language that everyone understood, a language that didn't need words, and the whole station was beginning to listen. The melody that flowed from the piano wasn't just sound. It was a living thing. It started soft like a whisper, but then it began to climb. It was a tune that most people recognized, even if they didn't know the name of it. It was classical, sophisticated, and incredibly beautiful. The notes were crisp and clean, ringing out with a clarity that seemed impossible in such a dirty, noisy place. The sound didn't just float away. It grabbed hold of the air. It cut through the rumble of the suitcases rolling across the floor and the distant screech of train brakes. It was like a beam of light piercing through a thick, dark cloud. The transformation was instant. Just seconds ago, the space around the piano was empty, a hallway people used to get from one place to another. Now, it was becoming the center of the universe. A businessman who had been walking with a fast, aggressive pace suddenly slowed down. He had been barking orders into his phone, his voice loud and demanding. But as the music reached his ears, his voice trailed off. He stopped mid-sentence. He lowered his phone, his eyes wide, staring at the source of the sound. He looked at the speakers on the ceiling, wondering if a recording was playing, but then he looked down and saw the small boy. It was a sight that didn't make sense to his brain. He saw the small legs dangling, the school blazer, the messy hair. But he heard the hands of a master. The confusion on his face was funny to watch. He shook his head as if trying to wake up from a dream, but the music didn't stop. It kept coming, wave after wave of perfect harmony. Nearby, a young woman was struggling with a heavy map and a cup of coffee. She was frustrated, her brow furrowed, looking for the right exit. The sound of the piano made her freeze. She turned toward the music, and her mouth opened slightly. The coffee cup in her hand wobbled a little, forgotten. The annoyance on her face melted away, replaced by a look of pure wonder. She took a step closer, drawn in like a moth to a flame. She wasn't the only one. The ripple effect was happening fast. People 10 meters away stopped to listen. People 20 meters away turned their heads. It was magnetic. There was something about the purity of the melody that demanded attention. It wasn't background noise. It was a story being told in a language everyone understood, but few speak well. The boy sat straighter on the bench. His eyes were closed now. He wasn't looking at the keys at all. He didn't need to. His fingers knew the way. It looked like the piano was playing him, rather than the other way around. The music was coming from somewhere deep inside him, a place that had nothing to do with school or homework or crowded train stations. His face was peaceful, almost serious. There was no smile, but there was a concentration that was intense. Every muscle in his small body was focused on the sound he was creating. The music began to shift. It moved from a gentle, rolling river into something more dramatic. The boy's left hand began to play a rhythm that was like a heartbeat, steady, strong, and insistent. His right hand started to dance faster. The notes became a blur of motion. It was incredibly difficult music. A professional pianist would struggle to make it sound so effortless. Yet this 7-year-old boy was making it look easy. His tiny hands flew across the octaves, stretching and jumping with a speed that made the onlookers gasp. A group of teenagers, who had been laughing loudly and pushing each other just moments before, went completely silent. They stood in a semicircle, their mouths slightly open. They didn't look bored anymore. They looked mesmerized. One of them slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone, but he didn't take a picture immediately. He just held it, watching the boy's hands, completely captivated. It was a reminder that true talent has no age. It doesn't matter if you are 7 or 70. If you are good, and everyone knows it. The crowd was growing thicker now. A wall of people was forming around the piano. They weren't rushing anymore. They weren't looking at their watches. They were just watching and listening. The station was still busy around the edges, people still running for trains. The announcements still blaring, but inside this circle, there was a different atmosphere. It was a bubble of calm. The air felt lighter. The grimy, gray walls of the station seemed to fade away, leaving only the shining black piano and the small boy. It was the contrast that made it so powerful. In a place full of hurry and worry, full of concrete and metal, here was this moment of delicate human beauty. It was like finding a flower growing in the middle of a crack in the sidewalk. The boy was pouring his heart into the instrument, and the crowd was drinking it in. They looked thirsty for it. In a world full of fake noises and digital sounds, this was raw and real. A mother with a crying baby walked up. The baby had been screaming at the top of its lungs, unhappy and tired. But as the piano music washed over them, the baby stopped crying. It looked at the piano, wide-eyed, listening. The mother looked down at her child, shocked, and then up at the boy with a look of gratitude. The music had soothed the child in a way nothing else could. It was a small miracle happening in real dash time. The boy didn't seem to notice any of this. He was lost in the storm of his own creation. The music was swelling, getting louder and more intense. The notes were tumbling over each other, cascading down the scale like waterfalls. He was playing with passion now. He would lean forward into the piano when the music got soft and then rock back when it got loud. He was physically connected to the sound. It was exhausting just to watch him, but he had endless energy. He looked like he could play forever. The silence of the crowd was heavy. It wasn't a bored silence. It was a respectful one. Nobody wanted to cough or shuffle their feet because they didn't want to miss a single note. They were holding their breath. Hundreds of strangers, all connected by this one small boy. They looked at each other occasionally, raising their eyebrows as if to say, "Can you believe this?" Or, "Do you see what I'm seeing?" It was a shared moment of disbelief. They all knew they were witnessing something special, something that doesn't happen every day. The rough, hard world of the commute had paused. If only for a few minutes, to let something beautiful through. As the melody climbed higher, reaching a peak of emotion, the boy's hands moved faster than ever. The sound was soaring, filling the entire hall. It was beautiful, but it was also shocking. It was shocking because it was so perfect. It was shocking because it came from nowhere. And it was shocking because it was coming from a child who should have been at home playing with toys, not mastering a grand instrument in a public station. The moment was hanging in the air, suspended in time, waiting for what would come next. The music was not just loud anymore. It was alive. It was growing, swelling like a giant wave that was getting ready to crash. The boy's hands were moving so fast that they were almost a blur. It was hard to track where one finger ended and the next began. He was playing with a speed and power that seemed impossible for someone with such small hands. The sound coming from the piano was roaring now, filling every corner of the huge station hall. It bounced off the tiled walls and the glass ceilings, shaking the dust in the air. The complexity of the piece was shocking. He wasn't just playing one line of music. He was doing 5 things at once. His left hand was jumping down low, playing a heavy, thundering rhythm that you could feel in the floorboards. His right hand was flying high up the keys, playing a melody that was sharp and bright, like sparks flying from a fire. Every note was perfect. There were no mistakes, no fumbling. It was flawless. The people watching were trying to find the trick. Was there a tape playing? Was this a stunt? But as they leaned in closer, they could see the hammers of the piano striking the strings in time with the boy's fingers. It was undeniably real. The crowd around the piano had grown from a small circle to a massive wall of people. It was hundreds deep now. The open space in the station, usually a walkway for people rushing to catch their trains, was completely blocked. But for the first time ever, nobody was complaining. Nobody was shouting, "Excuse me," or looking at their watches. The crowd was packed tight, shoulder to shoulder, all facing the same direction. It looked like a rock concert, but without the cheering. It was a sea of silent, open mouths. The energy in the air was electric. You could feel a buzz running through the people, a shared feeling of disbelief. Strangers were standing next to strangers, looking at each other with wide eyes, pointing at the boy, shaking their heads. They were communicating without speaking. They were all asking the same silent question: who is this kid? And how is this possible? People began to hold up their phones. Arms shot up into the air like a field of wheat. Red recording lights blinked on, capturing the moment. But even behind their screens, they were watching. The screens were just a way to hold on to the memory, but their real eyes were glued to the small figure on the bench. The video wouldn't catch the vibration in the floor, or the way the air pressure seemed to change. But the people standing there would never forget it. A tall man near the front, who looked like a music teacher perhaps, had dropped his briefcase. He was standing with his mouth open, his face pale. He recognized the piece. It was a masterpiece known for being incredibly difficult. He had seen grown adults with years of training struggle to play it well. He watched the boy's left hand cross over his right hand effortlessly, executing a complicated run of notes that sounded like a waterfall of diamonds. The teacher rubbed his eyes, unable to process what he was seeing. It defied logic. The physical reach of the boy's fingers was too small for some of the chords, yet he was stretching, compensating, finding a way to make it work. It was a display of pure, raw genius. The emotion in the music was hitting the crowd hard. It wasn't just a show of skill. It was full of feeling. The music was intense, angry at times, and then suddenly soft and pleading. The boy's body was moving with the sound. He would lean forward until his nose was almost touching the keys, digging into the low, dark notes, and then he would throw his head back, his eyes squeezed shut, as the music soared into the high, bright notes. He looked like he was fighting a battle or maybe praying. It was raw and honest. There was no ego in his playing. He wasn't trying to show off. He was just letting the music pour out of him. People in the crowd were starting to cry. It was a strange reaction to have in a dirty train station, but they couldn't help it. The beauty of it was overwhelming. A tough-looking construction worker, with dust on his boots and a helmet in his hand, wiped a tear from his cheek with a rough thumb. He looked embarrassed, glancing around to see if anyone saw him, but everyone else was wiping their eyes too. The music was cutting through all their defenses. It was reminding them of things they had forgotten, dreams they had given up on, or people they used to love. The boy was playing the soundtrack to their memories. The contrast was the most shocking part of all. Just 10 minutes ago, these people were worried about their taxes, their meetings, their dinner plans. They were annoyed by the noise and the crowding. Now, they were standing in a trance, transported to a different world by a 7-year-old boy in a school uniform. It was a moment of magic that had no business existing in such a mundane place. It was like finding a diamond in a pile of coal. The dirty floor, the rushing commuters, the fluorescent lights, it all seemed to fade away until there was nothing left in the world but the black piano and the boy. The boy was sweating now. A lock of his hair fell onto his forehead, but he didn't move to fix it. He was working hard. The physical effort was clear. His little arms were pumping, his shoulders were tensing and releasing. He was putting every ounce of energy he had into the instrument. He looked small and fragile, but his sound was huge and powerful. He was like a giant trapped in a child's body, and the piano was his only voice. As the music built towards its highest peak, the tension in the crowd became unbearable. Everyone was leaning forward, waiting, breath held. The notes were getting faster, cascading down the keyboard in a dizzying rush of sound. It was a storm of music. The boy's feet were swinging back and forth wildly, kicking the air because they still couldn't reach the pedals. He had to create the volume and the sustain with his hands alone, which made his playing even more aggressive and percussive. He was hitting the keys with precision, but with force. The noise of the station had been completely defeated. The announcements, the trains, the chatter, it was all gone, drowned out by the sheer power of the piano. The only sounds were the music and the collective heartbeat of 300 people. The security guard was standing right at the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed, a huge grin on his face. He wasn't going to stop this. Nobody was going to stop this. It felt like the world had stopped turning just to listen to this small boy play. The boy's face was flushed red. He looked fierce. He was attacking the climax of the song with a passion that was scary to watch. He was pouring his soul into the instrument, and the piano was singing back, louder and louder. It was a deafening roar of beauty. The people in the back of the crowd were standing on tiptoes, desperate to see, desperate to be part of this moment. They were witnessing a lightning bolt caught in a bottle. They knew, deep down, that they would tell this story for the rest of their lives. They would tell their children and their grandchildren about the day time stopped in the train station, all because a small boy sat down to play. The music reached a fever pitch, a chaotic and beautiful storm, hanging on the edge of the final, crashing note. The anticipation was so thick you could taste it. Then the moment everyone was waiting for arrived. The music rushed toward its end like a train speeding down the track. The boy's hands flew up the high keys and then crashed down on the low notes with incredible force. He struck the final 3 chords with authority. Boom, boom, boom. They were powerful, deep notes that seemed to shake the very floor of the station, and then his hands lifted off the keys. He stopped. For a split second there was absolute silence. It was a heavy, ringing silence that hung in the air. The final notes seemed to vibrate in everyone's chest, echoing off the walls and fading slowly away. No one moved. No one breathed. It was like the whole world had paused to listen to the echo. The boy sat with his hands hovering over the keys, his head still bowed, his eyes closed. He looked frozen like a statue. Then the bubble burst. A single person started clapping. It was the man in the gray suit. He slapped his hands together loudly, once, twice. Then the whole crowd erupted. It wasn't just polite applause. It was a roar. It was a wall of noise that matched the volume of the train station, but this noise was happy. The hundreds of strangers clapped, cheered, whistled, and stamped their feet. Some people shouted, "Bravo!" and "Encore!" It was the kind of reaction usually reserved for famous rock stars, not for a small child in a school uniform. The boy flinched. The noise seemed to wake him up from a trance. His eyes snapped open and he looked around, blinking rapidly. The intense look of genius that had been on his face vanished instantly. It was replaced by the look of a shy, scared little boy. He looked at the wall of people in front of him, their faces smiling, their hands flashing. He looked terrified. He wasn't a performer who wanted the spotlight. He was just a kid who loved music, and now he was the center of attention for hundreds of people. A flush of red crept up his neck and into his cheeks. He shrank back on the bench, pulling his hands into his sleeves. He didn't stand up to take a bow. He didn't wave or smile broadly. Instead, he gave a tiny, nervous twitch of his lips that was supposed to be a smile, but it looked more like a grimace. He looked down at his dangling feet, kicking them nervously against the piano leg. The crowd cheered even louder, encouraged by his shyness. They thought it was adorable. They saw the genius musician and the innocent child all at once, and it broke their hearts in the best way possible. The boy couldn't handle it anymore. He slid off the bench quickly. His feet hit the floor with a thud. He reached over and grabbed his backpack, swinging it onto his shoulders in one hurried motion. He didn't look at the piano again. He didn't look at the crowd to see their applause. He just wanted to escape. He turned and began to walk away, fast. The crowd tried to make way for him. The sea of people parted like the Red Sea. As he walked through the tunnel of clapping hands, people reached out. They wanted to pat him on the back or touch his shoulder just to say, "Well done," but he dodged them. He kept his head down, staring at the dirty floor tiles, walking as fast as his short legs could carry him. He moved like a frightened animal trying to get back to its burrow. "Play another one," a man shouted. "Who is that?" A woman asked the person next to her. "Incredible," whispered the security guard, shaking his head with a huge smile, but the boy didn't answer. He didn't stop. He disappeared into the rushing crowd of commuters on the other side of the hall. One moment he was there, a small figure in a blazer, and the next he was gone, swallowed by the mass of people. The crowd stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where he had been, waiting for him to come back. But he did and single quotes the clapping died down. People lowered their hands. The spell was broken, but the feeling in the air had changed completely. The station went back to its normal routine. The announcement board clicked again. The trains roared in on the tracks above. The rushing commuters started walking through the hall again, checking their phones and hurrying to their platforms, but the mood was lighter. The stress and the gray fog that usually hung over the station had lifted. The people who had stopped to listen were different now. Strangers turned to look at each other, not with annoyance or indifference, but with shared wonder. "Did you see that?" An elderly man asked a young student standing next to him. "Yes," the student replied, breathless. "I've never seen anything like that." "That wasn't just playing," the man said, shaking his head slowly. "That was magic. People put their phones away, but they didn't swipe their screens. They just stood there for a moment, letting the memory settle in. They knew they had just witnessed a lightning strike. It was one of those rare, perfect moments in life that comes out of nowhere and changes your day. The businessman picked up his briefcase, but he wasn't frowning anymore. He looked like he was remembering a dream he had forgotten. The woman who had been crying wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. Feeling strangely hopeful, the piano sat alone again on the floor. It was shiny and black, silent now. It looked just like it had 20 minutes ago, just a piece of furniture. But everyone who walked past it now looked at it with respect. They knew what it could do. The rush hour continued. The noise level went back up, but in the minds of the 300 people who had stopped, the music was still playing. They carried it with them onto the trains, onto the buses, and into their homes. They would tell the story at dinner that night. I was at the station, and this little boy just sat down and played like an angel. It was a moment of humanity in a place that usually forgot about humanity. A reminder that beauty can be found anywhere, even in the middle of a dirty, busy train station, and that sometimes the smallest people have the biggest things to say. The boy was gone, back to his normal life, whoever he was and wherever he came from, but he left a gift behind that day. He turned a Tuesday evening rush hour into a memory that would last forever.